Skinwalker, a horrifying tale about a skinwalker hunting a family. The skinwalker's cave had become overrun with the bones of its victims. Too many people had either caught a glimpse of it or escaped it, and because of that, the junction of I-160 and Highway 41, in the southwest corner of Colorado, was no longer a feasible hunting ground. Armed officers began searching for the creature responsible for the disappearances, as did myth hunters. For weeks the skinwalker sat in the mouth of its den, and now, it scanned a vast and exhausted desert. The skinwalker's skin was milky in color and clung tight to wiry muscles. It draped the hide of a coyote across his back, and he began to transform. A face that resembled half man, half coyote shifted from man to beast. His mouth elongated into a muzzle, and his eyes sank into his skull. Though his face resembled a coyote's, he still possessed human eyes. They captured subtle glints of the silver moon. From behind sheets of greasy and thin black hair, the skinwalker's eyes shifted. As its hair receded, a gentle wind pushed against it, and then fur bloomed from the pores of its skin. The skinwalker inched out of its cave as the bones in its legs popped and rearranged themselves, and now, except for its eyes, it had completed its transformation into a coyote. It sat in the maw of its den and howled at the moon. The cloudless sky hung over a vast gray desert, sparse with vegetation, and split by I-160. Shallow plumes of dust spiraled in protest of the breeze, and either dissipated in victory or flew westward in defeat as a wandering cloud of dirt. There were few animals skulking about, and even fewer people driving down the interstate. Accepting that it must move on to survive, the skinwalker trotted out of its den and stepped upon the harsh ground of the desert. The whistling breeze pushed against its fur as it sniffed the air and looked at I-160. It followed the interstate southwest, until it found a small home occupied by a family of 3, northwest of T2 Knotzbus Community School, about 8 miles away. Dohasan Yazi, a man in his late 30s and of Navajo descent, had spent the day toiling on a highway about 30 miles away from home. The labor was grueling. Intense. The heat of the desert mingled with hot pavement made the work so much worse and left his uniform soaked with sweat. He hung his blue and white striped shirt over their porch railing before entering his home, as he didn't want the smell of sweat or his work to stink up the couch. An orange and yellow vest hung beside the shirt. The Yazi home was a small 4-bedroom bungalow ranch-style house built in the middle of nowhere, accessible only by a single dirt path carved by those who drive on it. Built in the 60s, this house has had few occupants through the years. Dohasan and Sarah Yazi purchased the home in June of 2023, and Dohasan didn't mind that the purchase wiped out their savings, as this was their first home. And they were proud of it. This home, located off of I-160 northwest from Tisno's Pass, served as a middle point between where they wanted to go and where they were coming from, Thoreau, New Mexico. This home, out in the middle of nowhere, is nothing more than a temporary spot on their life journey. Sarah liked that the home was small, and the only way to get to it was to drive on a dirt road for about 10 minutes. From the interstate, the home was hardly visible, and because it was so far away, the sound of traffic didn't reach them. The home was white with a brown tinge because of the desert. There was plenty of yard space, and a sprawling mountain ridge that stood out against the dramatic backdrop of the Arizona sky. She worked from home as a customer service representative. So long as she had a quiet room to work in, a door that could lock, and an internet connection, she could work in the comfort of the spare bedroom they set aside for this purpose. The sun set in the distance as Dohasan stood in the kitchen. Before him simmered a stew. He stirred it every so often. Occasionally a carrot or sliver of onion would bubble to the surface. His mother was visiting, and though he didn't like her stew, he knew it was best to entertain her. A chunk of meat floated to the surface. Stirring the pot with a wooden spoon, Dohasan pushed down the meat chunk. He covered the pot with a lid and turned away from it. His daughter, Niabi, bounced on Atsa's knee, and relished the moment she shared with her granddaughter. Niabi was a young girl, 7 years old to be exact, who had been enrolled into an online school. Dohasan and Sarah agreed that to compensate for Niabi's lack of social interaction, they would take her to the park often, until they figured out a way to get her into school. Fortunately for them, Atsa lived down the block from a park, but unfortunately for them, Atsa lived more than 2 hours away. Though her hips, feet, and joints were bad, Atsa, she didn't slow down. She didn't know how to and knew that to feel young at her old age, she had to keep moving. Gardening, swimming, and power walking kept her somewhat thin, and as flexible as a 74-year-old woman can be. She smiled as she held her granddaughter and bounced her off her knee. She said, "Dohasan, you've bikoed this place, right?" Dohasan pressed his eyes shut as he turned away from his mother. He sighed as he pushed his fingers through his thick jet-black hair. Sarah sat up and turned her attention away from the television. Sarah said, "What does that mean?" Glaring at Dohasan, Atsa curled her lips and bit them. Though he didn't abandon his Navajo roots, he certainly didn't try to learn about them either. Atsa hissed, "You haven't told her? It means to carry out a ceremony to protect this place from skinwalkers." She pointed at the mountain range clearly visible from the living room window. "You got a sweetheart right here you need to watch out for." Dohasan turned around, opened the soup pot, and stirred it. Navajo culture, his heritage, it all felt like baggage he was forced to carry around. It did not take long for people to figure out that he was a Native American Indian, and when they did, the apologies would come. People apologizing for something they didn't do to someone who didn't suffer. Sorry for this. Sorry for that, yet he felt no one truly felt the words they spoke. No, they said what they said because that's what people are supposed to do. Apologize. Though he was grateful for their apologies, at some point in time, the apologies sounded like noise. Too many heartless words, too many people who wouldn't donate a dime to a Navajo Indian reservation, or any reservation for that matter, deeply apologetic for the length of their conversation. He wanted something that wasn't prefaced by the color of his skin or the knowledge of his heritage. To feel human, rather than an article from the past, that was what he wanted. Atsa understood her son's deeply seated resentment and believed that if he could go through life without anyone asking him about being a Navajo Indian, he would. Not because of shame, but because of the empty bits of sorrow and empathy thrust upon him by strangers. Knowing these truths, she understood why he chose to marry Sarah. Sarah didn't care about any of it and left the past where it belongs. In the past. She's a pale-skinned woman, bushy blonde hair, and hazel eyes. She didn't respond to Atsa's stories pertaining to skinwalkers, but expressed curious wonder about her husband's Navajo heritage. Sarah's eyes glazed over when the topic of these tall tales arose, and paid no attention when Atsa discussed Chindis, Natalaeus, skinwalkers, or anything else. Sarah wanted to learn about traditions, not mythological monsters. Niabi was the only person interested in these eerie stories, but Atsa restrained herself. The tale of her great-great-great-grandfather being a shaman who then became corrupt, and transformed into a skinwalker around these parts has no business in the imagination of a 9-year-old. Niabi didn't know about that story, but Dohasan sure did. He was raised on corn, black beans, and ancestral stories. It wasn't until he reached his late teens that he began to question their validity. Once he had moved out, he rejected them entirely. Hating his heritage wasn't what he felt. No, Dohasan wanted to move on from the past he wasn't a part of and build a future with his wife. He set the lid back onto the pot and faced his mother. Niabi had stopped bouncing, and Atsa sat still and quiet, staring into the vast expanse of desert beyond the living room window. Atsa felt ice form in her throat as the sun set in the distance. Her skin crawled in ways she couldn't describe. She knew something was out there watching them. The skinwalker sat beside the brown husk of a tree. Broken by a strike of lightning many months ago, the split tree served as reasonable coverage for the skinwalker. The moon was full and cast its silver glow across the desert. Dust, thin and sturdy, brushed against the skinwalker's fur coat. It slunk low to the ground as its fur swayed against the wind. Eyes, sharp and focused, remained on the small Yazi home. Twigs and debris crunched beneath its feet as it crept closer to its target. Though the wind pushed against its fur, and the scent of boiled meat enticed its hunger, the skinwalker remained focused on its meal, the Yazi family. 3 vehicles sat side by side. A 2012 blue Chevy Silverado, white 2001 Ford Focus, and a gray 2015 Subaru Forester. Of all the vehicles, the Focus had the least amount of rust and still ran quite well. This car belonged to Sarah, a graduation present. Her father bought it brand new and maintained it better than any other man ever could. The Silverado hardly ran right, but it still ran nonetheless. A dream catcher hung on the review mirror of the Forester, and 2 feathers were kept in the dash. A small, handcrafted Navajo blanket lay rolled up in the back windshield. It hasn't been unrolled for at least 3 years. A sudden pop, and the revving of an engine caught the skinwalker's attention. It dropped its body low and lay as close to the ground as it could get. A shabby hatchback darted down the highway, misfiring every so often. Once it had passed, the sound of crickets returned, as well as the distant hoots of owls. The skinwalker closed the distance between itself and the 4-bedroom bungalow. Facing the highway was a small porch. The scent of Dohasan's work clothes wafted into the skinwalker's nose. Its eyes closed as it tasted the salty air, and it was then that its mouth began to water. Something about the taste of man excited it. Perhaps it was the hunt, and the challenge it brought. The Skinwalker approached the vehicles and studied each one. It walked along the porch, below the windowsills. With deft paws, it positioned itself just outside the living room window, and there it sat and listened. Dohasan breathed a sigh of relief once he shoveled out the last bit of stew from the pot and into the fourth bowl set out onto the counter. Dinner would be had, and his mother would be off, and then he could finally relax. Carrying one bowl in each hand, he said, "Time to eat. Stew's done a brewin'." Niabi and Atsa had found a new game to play. Sarah dug out a game called Mousetrap from the closet and set it up. 2 hours had passed since the first game and the game was now wrapping up. Niabi clenched her fists as she watched the trap descend on Atsa's mouse. She cheered as Atsa playfully moaned that she lost yet again. Sarah cleaned up the game and put it back into the closet before sitting down next to her husband. Niabi and Atsa washed their hands together and played in the sink. Neither Sarah nor Dohasan cared that their daughter and grandmother played for so long in the bathroom. Once they had finished goofing off, the four of them had a pleasant meal. Atsa inquired about Sarah's new job and wished that she could also work at home. Dohasan brought up the topic of his late father, and Atsa was reminded of a time that belongs to the past. She lost her husband 3 years prior due to colon cancer. Times were rough back then, and they still are now. They ate their soup, bickered over who would do the dishes, and ultimately, both Dohasan and Sarah conceded to Atsa's demands. Her words rang in Dohasan's head, "I am not a guest, I am your mother. Sit down and let me do the dishes." Every last dish had been dried and put away, the floor swept clean, and the table wiped off. Niabi sat in her pajamas on the couch, and they were finishing up Tim Burton's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Atsa chuckled as she said, "They'd have to kick me out of that place. I'd come out of there with more than a stomachache and candy, I'd also have type 2 diabetes." The movie finished and Niabi, though reluctantly, rushed off to bed. Atsa kissed her goodnight and bid farewell to her son and daughter-in-law. With the door at her back, Atsa glanced around one last time, and started her car with the key fob. The headlights flashed on, and she peered at the daunting mountain range glaring back at her. Her skin began to crawl as she stepped out of the home, and once the door shut, she felt naked in the cool desert air. The sound of laughter and television were replaced by gales of wind carried from the west. Her jacket flapped open as her hair was pushed around. Left idling, the Forester doors clicked as they unlocked. Atsa walked out from the porch and toward her car. For reasons she couldn't explain, her heart began to race, and she felt as though tunnel vision was circling in on her. Atsa glanced over her shoulder, only to see tumbleweeds passing across the desert. As she grabbed the handle of the Forester door, she looked into the back of her car. Nothing. Nothing was there. A sigh escaped her lungs as she opened the door and sat down. She was wrong. Something was there, and she had yet to discover it. Dohasan and Sarah finally had a moment to relax. Though they had only one child, that one child was still a handful. A few hours had passed since Atsa left, and Dohasan thought nothing of it. He stood in the bathroom, in front of a large vanity mirror, brushing his teeth. Work begins tomorrow at 5 in the morning, and knowing that it's already 11 at night, he has accepted that tomorrow is going to be a groggy and painful day. Sarah stood in front of the bedroom window, staring at 2 blaring red lights in the distance. For a moment she thought she could hear a horn but wasn't too sure. She turned around and called for her husband. She said, "Honey, come here. Do you hear a car horn?" Dohasan left the bathroom and crossed to the other side of their bedroom toward Sarah. He stopped brushing, and for a moment he heard it. He said, "Are those lights? Is that a car?" While searching for his phone, he spat out the toothpaste into the sink and rinsed his mouth with water. He called his mother, but she did not answer. Sarah hurried out of the bedroom, only to return a moment later with a pair of binoculars. Dohasan dialed again to no avail. In the few brief moments he spent trying to call his mother, Sarah studied the 2 red lights. Her stomach sank once she understood what she was looking at. She passed the binoculars to her husband. He looked through and shouted, "That's a Forester, Mom's car." The Skinwalker had already picked her bones clean. All that remained was Atsa's dried-out skin. It studied the trail it left behind in the desert. A shallow pool and speckles of crimson were near the Forester, leaving behind a trail to its new den. It knew that it would need to cover that trail. As the Skinwalker sat, he transformed back into his human form. The skin of the walker was milky white, and he had very long black hair. Eyes, deep and brown, scanned the desert as he felt the brush of dust pass between his fingers. This man, a hunter, a shaman, a murderer, has forgotten who he was. His name? He doesn't know. Family? Forgotten. Heritage? Erased. Does he know that he is no longer a man, but a beast in disguise? Does he know that he hunts his descendants, and that he has taken the life of his distant granddaughter? He does not and could not. The only thing this skinwalker knows is hunger. A hunger that can never be satisfied. A fitting punishment for the crime he committed many lifetimes ago. Though he is unaware of his past, he is alert to the present. He crawled deep into the wet cave and removed the skin of a bear. Slipping its skull over his head, the skinwalker covered himself with the bear's skin. Patches of fur were missing, and the edges of the dried-out skin were frayed. Once the bear's skin touched his own, his bones began to shift. Fur grew from the pores of his skin as his bones rearranged. Muscles expanded while he hunched over and emitted guttural groans. His hands swelled as his nails became black claws and heavy. The skinwalker moaned in agony, at first resembling a man and then a bear. His transformation was complete. He left his cold and damp cave to erase his trail. Hassan slipped on his work boots and a thin jacket. He stood in the doorway, glaring at the forester, a quarter-mile down the road. The horn blared much louder now that he had opened the door, and the night air felt cool against his skin. Carrying his phone, flashlight, and a crowbar, he marched toward the forester. Glancing over his shoulder, he noticed Sarah standing in the doorway, leaning to one side, arms folded, waiting. His phone buzzed in his hand. A new text message had been received. It read, "Not going anywhere, don't worry." Hassan nodded and slipped his phone into his pocket. As the distance between him and the forester closed, he aimed the flashlight toward the vehicle and clicked it on. A yellow beam of light illuminated the vast desert, revealing small rocks, bramble bushes, dead trees, and cacti, none of which gave any clues to Otz's whereabouts. He pointed the flashlight at the forester, slowing his pace as he cautiously flanked to the right of it. The flashlight revealed little and told no secrets about Otz's disappearance. As he surveyed the front of the vehicle, he realized that the front bumper was in good condition, suggesting that perhaps the forester had rolled into the boulder. While studying the interior of the forester, he saw a stick wedged into the seat and pushing into the horn. Though he felt relief knowing his mother's vehicle wasn't involved in a crash, he felt this sour feeling in his stomach. He wondered why the stick was positioned in such a way, and how the vehicle veered so far off the interstate. Hassan opened the passenger door and broke the stick in half. The blaring horn ceased, and silence remained. Scanning the seat and searching the dash for clues, he found nothing. Not a single scratch, or torn seat. Nothing. However, the deep guttural groans of a bear manifested behind him. Hassan ignored the sound he heard, because bears weren't too common in Arizona, and he guessed that it was probably a man or his imagination. A second groan pierced the silence and captured his attention, for it wasn't the groan of a man, but of a bear. The cool night air now chilled the marrow in his bones as his stomach turned to ice. As his hands trembled, he readied his crowbar. Footsteps, heavy and thick, circled behind him. He blindly swung his crowbar and hit nothing. Looking in every direction he possibly could, he searched for the bear but found only desert. Hassan closed his eyes and exhaled. A groan, deep and furious, came from his left. Wafting into his nose was a musky, earthy odor. The scent was quite foul and caused him to slightly gag. He shone the flashlight in the direction of the scent and sounds. A bear stood 10 feet from where he was. Human-like eyes stared at him. They reflected the flashlight and appeared to possess a faint glow. Hassan felt his stomach drop, because he knew that what was in front of him wasn't a beast. Bear eyes are typically dark brown or amber, and the iris stretches beyond the bounds of the eyelid. Hassan saw the whites of the creature's eyes, its pupils and iris, and felt it was a human staring at him. He reminded himself of the stories he tried to forget. Though he did not want to admit it, he knew something far fiercer than a bear was hunting him. It was a skinwalker. Squeezing the crowbar, Hassan swung it to and fro, striking the bear in the side and across the face. A cracked tooth exploded from the bear's mouth and skittered across the desert floor. As the bear towered over him, he felt hopeless because the beast remained unfazed by his attacks. Suddenly, a deafening roar washed over Hassan as the skinwalker howled with rage. He fell to his back, turned around and began to flee. As he looked forward, his home came into view. His lung ached as he sprinted through the desert, until, at last, he arrived home to Sarah still standing in the doorway. She said, "I saw you go behind that boulder. Everything okay?" Hassan turned and scanned the desert. Nothing was out there. Not a coyote, or hawk, or even a bear. Nothing. He scratched his head and tried to figure out what had just happened. Uncertainty and confusion consumed him as he passed through the doorway. Sarah quietly closed the door and locked it. She said, "Honey, is everything okay?" Dohasan filled a glass with water and sat down at the kitchen table. He couldn't find the words he needed to express how he felt and did his best to mumble through his incoherent thoughts. He said, "Car is fine. She's not out there. Saw a bear." He tilted the cup onto his lips. "A bear in Arizona. A black bear." Sarah said, "Keep it down. Niabi is sleeping, and I know bears aren't very common here, but they do still occasionally come around." Dohasan sneered as he said, "No, I'm sure they're around, but to happen upon one in the desert by my mom's car? Not likely. That thing had human eyes. I can't explain it any other way than that. Human eyes. Sarah, we need to call the police, right now." He sat silent for a moment as Sarah walked away from the kitchen and called the police. He digested the event which unfolded. A bear with human eyes, the sudden disappearance of his mother, it all seemed too difficult to believe. He drank his water and turned away from Sarah. Once she hung up the phone, she said, "Honey, I'm sure there's an explanation for all of this. Maybe a snake was in your mom's car, and it scared the crap out of her and tried to get out and run away from it. I don't know." Dohasan trembled as he sat. He did not have an answer to the questions which beckoned him, and neither did Sarah. There, at the kitchen table, they sat for a long and quiet hour. Sarah filled a small cup with sleep aid and passed it to her husband. He drank it and soon fell into a restless slumber. 3 cups of coffee and a Red Bull couldn't shake off the grogginess Dohasan felt as he drove to work. Sarah had cooked eggs, bacon, hash browns, and buttered toast, a gesture to make her husband feel better. He enjoyed her meal, but the side effects of the sleep aid and lack of good sleep kept him on the edge of returning to slumber once more. As the day progressed, and he began to wake up, the eerie sense that something was wrong returned to him. He counted the hours as they passed by. 8 in the morning. No return phone call from his mother. 9, 10, 11, 2, 3, and now 5 in the evening. Still, no phone call. Before he hung up his construction hat, he checked his phone one last time. Not a single missed call, yet, he had called her phone more than a dozen times. Sarah had called Atsa, too, if only to subdue the anxiety which had started to gnaw on her. The stories of skinwalkers, and the tales Atsa told began to creep into her mind. What if they were real? What if a skinwalker took her? She thought of those things and more as she tidied up the home while waiting for work to come to her. Working from home answering customer service calls had its perks, but sometimes no one called and there was nothing to do. At 6 in the evening Dohasan came home from work and dragged himself through the doorway and toward the kitchen. He patted Niabi on the head as he passed and rubbed Sarah's back. He ran cold water from the faucet and proceeded to catch it with his hands. The cool water felt nice, refreshing, and once he had filled his hands, he splashed it onto his face. He said, "This feels like a dream." Sarah nodded and stirred the potato salad she had been working on for the previous half hour. It was finished, but at least stirring the thing gave her something to do. Sarah wrapped her arms around his waist and squeezed him tight. She said, "Maybe it is. Maybe it is." A few days passed and Atsa still hadn't called. Dohasan suspected he knew why, but refused to admit it.